Yeah, just a shout out to the unceded lands of the Awabakal and Warramai that I'm on today. Just kicking off, to situate the school strike for climate, it's important to consider climate change. And that's really what drew me into this type of research, and particularly the younger people that are participating in the movement. I think almost infamously now, people know this narrative about Greta Thunberg in 2018, with her solo climate strike outside the parliament in Sweden. But it's called Friday for the Futures in Europe, Youth Strike for Climate in the Americas, and School Strike for Climate elsewhere. I just wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that the movement is sitting alongside other movements that are agitating for climate change action. With a variety of protest tactics, and it's important to acknowledge them because in some of the conversations that I've been having with my respondents for my doctoral research, they pay attention to what else is being done in this climate change space. So I've just listed a couple of the organisations that have come up in the research that I've been doing, which include XR in Australia, Extinction Rebellion in Australia, Rising Tide, Blockade Movement, and also even out to the sort of more established, older school environmental movements like Greenpeace and the Wilderness Society. So Han and Arn have called School Strike for Climate one of the most widespread environmental social movements in history. And I suspect that that was probably informed by the rapidity with which the global movement took off. Greta Thunberg's solo strikes were in 2018. And in March of 2019, we were looking at about 108, 110 countries around the world involving millions of people. And so the enlistment of this broad support has been spoken about elsewhere in social movement studies, and that there's a relatively simple idea to get behind that is broad enough and safe enough to incorporate a lot of people, and it is particularly youth-led. That's certainly my experience here. I mean, it sort of goes with the name, of course, School Strike. But, at this formative time of young people's lives, there's also other things to consider about who, identity formation, transitions to adulthood, and also some of the things that I've found in my own research, which are that there seems to be a relatively hard cap on the age with which participants leave the movement and make way for other generations inside the movement, which I found interesting. But anyway, all of these things are happening at the same time as these other climate change movements, and one of the things I also wanted to draw people's attention to just there on the slide is that there's escalating calls for a diversification of school strikes, movement goals, essentially. There's a lot of, Bowman's mentioned that environmental justice is becoming a better articulated part of the school strike movement. But, in the past, others have said that the movement claims are too vague, the movement goals are too vague, and then almost alternately that they're too radical, So it's got a lot of attention around that. My doctoral research was over 2 locations in the Newcastle Hunter area and Melbourne. I did 23 semi-structured qualitative interviews as well as ethnographic studies of 3 school strike events. The first was the traditional march. The second was it's called the People's Blockade up here in Newcastle. And the second was an offshoot of the main school strike movement in Melbourne that was targeting the NAB Bank for their involvement in funding fossil fuels. So I'm just going to concentrate on the political participation part of my research today. My research questions were more around political participation, relational, the relational aspect of social movement participation. But I'm doing that through the prism of class, which I haven't quite analysed to the extent of talking about it in depth. So today I'm just going to concentrate on political participation. And it's worth saying that, Harris and Vroman particularly sort of gave us this broader understanding of what was political about people's practices. And so taking those broader definitions that say they sort of let down, other academics have come along and said, well, not only are these political practices, but there's this other element that's got more to do with this individualization narrative and this life biography narrative that's going on. And I found that work really informative. As you'll see on my next slides, this is now really informing my thinking about this eco-responsibilization that's going on. And that the eco-responsibilization, I've put it in brackets there, I'm sort of finding that there's a blend between and a switching between an environmental identity and a political identity. And so acts that they're practicing can be seen in both lights, and they're given equal weight. One of the other things that I sort of found in this investigation around this responsibilization was this reflexive questioning that's going on. And it does lead, I mean, other academics have spoken about this ambivalence that can lead to. But I'm sort of concentrating more on these high levels of skepticism about the impact of their practices and their political protests. But that's coupled with an affective dimension that they can internally reconcile. That people that are the people that were expressing skepticism about the impact of both their environmental practices and their political protest were doing that very overtly because it just made them feel better. And just to mention Pickard there, that this is all happening to younger people that are sort of being left out of an adult narrative, and they're just doing this for themselves. So going into the analysis of some of the stuff that I'm writing about at the moment, as I've just touched on, there's this connection between personal practices and collective practices, and a real enmeshment of this environmental knowledge and environmental essence of a feeling of one with an environmental identity and being a politically active person. And some of the participants that I spoke to, for example, were actually only at a climate strike rally, school strike rally, because it had a climate bent. They would go to each and every climate event that they were. The people that I responded to that said that, were not only going to all of these other things as well as becoming vegan because of their environmental credentialing, but they also were the same people that were educating others inside the movement. One of the things that I'm most sort of interested in at the moment that I'm writing about is vegetarian and vegan diets, and the high proportion of my respondents that were vegan or vegetarian, pescatarian in one sense, but they were doing it for overtly environmental reasons. And that those that were most deeply involved in school strike organizing were the most sort of strict about their diet intake, and were quite open about the reasons that they were doing that and the practices that they were exhibiting. And as others have found, the strictness of their veganism was also aligned to how they felt about politics, so that they were doing it for environmental reasons, but they were also the most politically articulate people that I spoke to. One of the things that I'm also concentrating on is this sort of spontaneous peer education that's going on inside the movement. Almost all of the respondents that I interviewed were, enthusiastic enough to respond to my invitations to come and have an interview about it. So, you're sort of self-selecting in a certain sense. But even some of the respondents that were relatively politically naive in terms of governmental functions and structures and civics education in that sense, were relying on their peers to educate them about the political process, as well as relying on other peers to educate them about the environmental effects of climate change and things like vegetarian and vegan diets and the impact that has on the environment. So this, POSMEC sort of understanding of this connection between the eco-responsibilization that's happening and individualization is being sort of influenced from the side by their peers who are saying, hey, you should be a vegan, or vegan's really good because it reduces impact on the environment. And just as that last point on that slide mentions, I'm doing this in this sort of this class-based frame. So I'm looking also at who are the people that came into the research study and what are they talking about. So I've mentioned this reflexive questioning that's occurring about their protest efficacy, and it sort of reminded me of Bang's idea about the expert citizen. And for a lot of the people that I spoke to, I would, hasten to say I don't want to judge anyone, but they were sort of like that Bang's definition of an expert citizen through and through. They were easily articulating what they were there for, what they were about. It was a big part of their practices, and it was a big part of this educative environment. And this personal and collective identity formation is really what's interesting me at the moment, primarily because of this blurring of the individual and the collective. And this, it's exhibited with the respondents that I spoke to, particularly about these practices, but they're also there because they are quite active in school strike. Yeah, so the environmental knowledge might have come first, but then the political knowledge was very rapidly assumed when they became involved with the movement, or they came to the movement because they were politically motivated, and then they were influenced in this environmental direction. And I'll get to a quote to close out, but there's an activist identity that's formulating inside the movement that has these sort of two wings of the identity attached to them. And that the activist was most closely aligned, well, at least the respondents that I spoke to, with how well they were articulating a political message, and how well they could articulate the movement goals, what they sought to change about society, and the methods of protest that they were going to engage in to achieve those aims. And the environmental identity was most closely associated with those people that had a prior education of some kind, a formal education of some kind, about ecological or environmental matters. And that most likely came at university, because I was, most of my respondents had just gotten into university. And in a couple of cases, those respondents had learned that in civics and environmental classes at their high school. And so, yeah, just that peer education is happening and blending, and there's bits of this and there's bits of that and there's bits of the next thing. So I might just close out with this that sort of encapsulates everything that I've just said. And it's that Serena sort of articulated this in the most sort of overt way. And we were talking about, we were actually talking about veganism, and we were actually talking about diet modification. But she did this segue in the interview and drew my attention to the fact that this is the reason that she classes herself as an activist. So there's this big, strong sentiment there. She's quite solidly encapsulating this self-identity as an activist. And then as a sort of throwaway line, she sort of, adds to this by saying, well, I care about the environment, so that's why I went vegan. There was just a connection there for her. Whether it was a self-identity as an activist first, and then the decision to become vegan, I didn't have an opportunity to ask. But on reflection, this is a really strong connection. So in the context of having this discussion about veganism and vegetarian diets, she's sort of immediately going, well, I'm an activist, and therefore I did something about that environmental stuff. Like, I care about the environment. This is how I show my care for the environment. This is how I'm doing this on a day-to-day basis. Like, this is an embodied practice that, veganism particularly is a little bit more onerous than vegetarianism, which is a bit more onerous than pescatarian diets. But for her, all of that was sort of subsumed with the fact that she was an activist first and foremost. That's kind of what she did. That was what she sort of expected of herself. And I mean, as I said, Serena was probably the most articulate about this exact connection and this point. But this was exhibited throughout most of the interviews that I conducted about this. So Khan, for example, says that he cares about the environment, which means eating less meat. But this connection is solid throughout most of the work that I've been doing so far. I'm going to leave it there. I'm conscious of people's times. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Milo. And now we might move straight away on to Olivia. So thanks, Olivia.
So I guess I'll just really quickly talk about where the paper that we presented at TASA last year came from. So the project and the research team, between 2018 and 2022, the team undertook 74 semi-structured interviews aimed at understanding the business and political response to the charged and difficult task of weaning the Australian economy off its dependence on fossil fuel generated energy. Informants included representatives from industry associations or corporations within the energy sector, current and former members of parliament, and employees of government bodies or non-government organisations with an interest in energy questions. That slide there is showing a table which breaks down the categories that we placed interview respondents into. And so this work builds on decades of work by my co-authors who've all been engaged in trying to understand why action to address climate change has proven so difficult. Christopher Wright and Daniel Nyberg work on these topics within the business school, and Vanessa Bowden, who I noticed is online, hi Vanessa, within the discipline of sociology. So there's a multidisciplinary kind of approach happening here. I came on board as an RA in 2021 and have more of a kind of multitasking research background. This is the first project that I've worked on that looks explicitly at climate change, but I've always been interested in interconnections between humans and the world around us. So I guess I kind of bring that a little bit of that perspective to this project. So at TASA last year, we presented the paper called Folk Devils, Fairy Tales and Fossil Fuels, the figure of the climate activist in Australian political discourse. And this paper focused on how the fossil fuel hegemony in Australia misrepresents climate activists who oppose the continuation of business as usual as a means of upholding their hegemonic position of fossil fuels. To understand the political dynamics of delegitimizing fossil fuel critique, we investigated the fossil fuel industry's political manoeuvring, and in particular that mischaracterization of the counter-hegemonic movements as either malevolent or naive. So that's the Folk Devils and the Fairy Tale Princess of our paper's title. We're drawing here on the theoretical concepts of hegemony and figures and figuration, which I'll now really briefly introduce. So our understanding of hegemony is based largely on Gramsci's approach, where he argues that to win a political contest without overwhelming force and coercion requires concessions and compromises to create a system which mobilizes the majority of the population. And so it's not simply about forming a coalition of the willing, rather the hegemony involves a continuous process of winning the consent of key actors to form a ruling bloc over society. In the contemporary context, Gramsci's ideas have been used to explain the inordinate influence of business on climate policy across a number of different nations. In these countries, fossil fuel hegemony comprises a coalition of actors with aligned interests that support carbon-dependent economic growth and aim to limit legislation to hamper emissions mitigation. And this is all happening despite the increasing public acceptance of climate science. And so there are numerous studies emerging now from different national contexts that explore how the fossil fuel industry has gained the consent of key actors in supporting a continued dependence on coal, oil, and gas. I might just quickly skip that paragraph. Within these contexts, the activities of these of the fossil fuel hegemony ensures that reliance on fossil fuel energy is articulated as a collective will and common sense. In these contexts, the obvious position of addressing climate change through radically reducing fossil fuel usage is characterized as unrealistic or naive. And so it's in understanding this split between seeing the link between fossil fuels and climate change, yet still continuing to rely on fossil energy, that we find Laclau and Mouffe's reworking of hegemony useful. They build on Gramsci's legacy. They developed an underlying logic of the social and contingent constitution of hegemony, replacing Gramsci's positive essence of social totality with a negative emphasis on antagonism. So it's not unity or commonality of, say, class interest or political coalitions that holds hegemonic projects together in changing the economic structure. Rather, for Le Clau and Mouffe, it is difference. In our understanding, that doesn't mean that hegemonic projects have set aside the task of creating equivalence through connecting heterogeneous demands and interests. Rather, both social totality and antagonism are at play. So while the fossil fuel sector consists of factions of competing fossil fuel industries and interests, within the hegemonic project, these industries are held together by their opposition to common adversaries in the form of, for example, environmental activists or green political parties. Looking at figures and figuration, we can see that a difference in the form of an other is always needed in establishing hegemony. The hegemonic project demands a limit to be meaningful. However, there's no inherent logic underlying this beyond that constructed difference. And challenges to this construction must constantly be guarded against. So in this paper, we're interested in tracing the ways in which Australia's fossil fuel hegemony counters the potential for counter-hegemonic transformation through discursive attacks on the figure of the climate activist. And in order to do this, we take inspiration from a long history of theoretical approaches to figures and figuration. Figures are not only subject positions, they are images associated with broader political narratives and myths used to delineate boundaries of us and them, as in the figure of the stranger. Figures, thus, are technologies of power that work through the affects. According to Cohen, the term folk devil denotes those figures who are described in public discourse and especially in the media as a threat to society. Folk devils, therefore, are boundary-making figures in that they are used to define concepts of right and wrong, us and them, and to defend the social order against conflict, change, or ambiguity. They can also serve to shore up hegemonic power structures as representatives of the ruling institutions, use folk devils to divert attention from their own harmful actions. So folk devils are employed to establish a political frontier. And another common inspiration for the tropes that are deployed in establishing a political frontier is the tradition of the fairy tale. Fairy tales are part of a long storytelling tradition that engages imaginatively with other and better worlds. Historically, the messages of folk and fairy tales often ran counter to hegemonic worldviews, and so they became objects to be controlled. And so we're taking up this idea to look at Australian political discourses around climate activists. So in Australian political discourse, we can trace correlations between the framing of fairy tales as not to be taken seriously and the claims that climate activists do not live in the real world. At the same time, climate activist concerns are commodified in corporate greenwashing and political point scoring. The climate activist as folk devil is opposed to other more palatable forms of change. In this way, we argue the climate activist is a double-faced figure, at once dangerous and hopelessly naive, a figure that has come to symbolize the discrediting myth mobilized by the fossil fuel hegemony that action to reduce emissions will destroy our way of life, and presumably that climate change won't. So I'm just going to really briefly now run through some of the results. I've got a few quotes from interviews that demonstrate these two views. This first quote really brings out that double-faced figure of the climate activist, where one interviewee simultaneously infantilizes one set of activists while demonizing another. And I'll just point out the point of the quote that I think is really important here, where they're talking about the youth of some activists is pointed to as a sign of naivety, while other older activists are demonized, described as using environmental concerns as a smokescreen to bring about the communist revolution. In another example, we find climate activists described as irritants, engaging in dangerous stunts. And here, again, there's a clear demarcation between climate activists and the rest of the population that accepts that we need to do something on climate, but don't want to be slowed down as they go about their way of life. And And that sense that climate activists are out of touch with reality is reinforced in the second figuration of the climate activists that we identify. Here, however, climate activists can be ignored not because they're too extreme, but because they are infantilized, seen as idealists rather than realists. And here's another quote from another interviewee who describes those working with an environmental bent working in policy as the Cinderella corridor enthusiasts, quite junior, but will they ever be able to make the grade? In this construction, the climate activist is a gendered figure, feminine or at least not masculine enough, unlikely ever to grow hairs on their chest or move on up into a position of real power. Further evidence of naivety can also be found in the very act of calling for action on climate change, according to our interviewees. So in this argument, climate activists do not understand technologies of power generation, economic policy, or workforce development. And here's another example where the Greens Party are described as paying lip service to the idea of a just transition without having a well thought out plan. And so here the Greens Party specifically and climate activists more generally are both referenced within this quote, represented as being manipulative, ticking the social justice box, and naive. They've got no idea how to make it happen. Never mind that constantly delaying any kind of transition planning is even more likely to result in mass layoffs of workers. And so just to conclude today's talk, by framing climate activists in this way, representing them as either dangerous and manipulative or naive and unrealistic, conversations about what to do about climate change can be contained and managed in a way that suits the industry. It becomes accepted as common sense that reliance on fossil fuels is what provides us with the kind of life we're used to. It demonstrates that element of the hegemonic project that involves defining a border and inside with the normal commonsensical business as usual approach that locks in reliance on fossil fuels, and an outside in which climate activists are not like us in inverted commas. Through this doubly discrediting discourse, climate change activists' concerns can be dismissed. Since climate activists' main vision is a fossil fuel-free future, by extension, such a vision is also framed as either completely disruptive, dragging us back to the Stone Age, as another interviewee put it, or the fairy tale dream of one who is yet to wake up from reality, yet to wake up to reality. And just a quick note to sign off, on the activists themselves. Most of our interview data comes from people in positions of power with varying degrees of connection to the fossil fuel hegemony. There's some resistance in the interviews of, some discussion in the interviews of resistance to the characterizations described, particularly from interviews with representatives from environmental NGOs, some of whom also engage in activism. But to keep within the time, I've not included those today. And then just to sign off, what's happening next is we're continuing to work with this data. There's a lot of really rich data for analysis in these interviews. We're also now beginning the work of media analysis to support and perhaps challenge some of the findings from the interviews themselves, both for this paper and for other papers that are in the works under development. And alongside that ongoing analysis, we're in the development stage on some new research, which kind of builds on that business focus, though still very much with an awareness of the political and social context in which businesses operate and which they help to create. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olivia. Two great papers based around really good research. And now we're going to move on to Judith and Rob, and they've got some work that a number of papers that they're doing. So thanks, Judith.
All right, thank you. And thank you for organising this session. It's great. Good to hear the other speakers as well. What we're going to do, Rob and I are going to tag because the work we're doing it together. But it is basically, the big context is an ARC grant that we got. It's called New Possibilities, Young People and Democratic Renewal. And we're doing that with Pip Collins from UNSW, Michelle Catazaro from UNSW, Faith Gordon from ANU, and Stuart Jackson from University in Sydney, Rob and I are from RMIT. And of course, our amazing Luigi De Martino, who's sort of holding it all together. So the project, we got the money for this year, so it's in the early stages. Having said that, we were one of the people who had our project vetoed by the amazing Stuart Robert. So we had to resubmit and we were successful. During that time, I need to say that we really felt affirmed because the senior managers in each of our universities actually got together and gave us money to do the project in the meantime, which was terrific and really sort of put wind under our wings. So we're interested in, so Rob's going to talk more particularly about the paper we gave at the last TASA meeting that we've got in the process of review at the moment. So the project is about student climate change action, and we're wanting to know, like obviously what they're doing, who they are, how they represent themselves, and how they're represented or misrepresented by others. And we're involving young people, students as co-researchers as much as possible. And in doing so, we kind of got echoes in our head of Alain Touraine, who did a similar thing with the Solidarity movement in Poland, where I suppose the bottom line for us is the question of like what we're doing there and how are we politically present. So that's sort of like an interesting side project for how we actually do that. And we're looking in particular at the moment anyway, the question of different forms of leadership, different or new old kinds of political practices, and finding some pretty interesting things right at this, beginning stage to do with, and Rob will talk about this in a minute, but the gender composition, the large number of very young women and girls who are assuming leadership positions in the public sphere, speaking powerfully to politicians and answering back. So we're looking at all kinds of different kinds of, action. So that would, of course, be online action of various kinds, political protest, legal action, and the people we're looking at, young people as young as 6. That's sort of, and it was interesting too, even when we were putting the application together, some of the responses that we got when we were talking about the age range, it was really revealing in terms of how people responded to us, acknowledging that children, very young children, can and do exercise agency and have very clear ideas about these kinds of issues. So we're particularly interested in the politics of it, and that is like not just what young people are doing, but also the responses to what they're saying, and the politics of those responses from parents, politicians, and industry leaders. The kinds of material that we're using are artifacts, interviews, speeches, of course, which there are just so many of them, photographs, placards. We're really interested also in the use of political satire by many of the young people, surveys, and also sort of online coverage. And I think like a lot of sociologists at the moment, we're sort of participating in what we might call the affective turn, looking at the role of, moral emotions and political emotions like love and patriotism, anger and resentment, and how they sort of can be used as an energizing force for mobilisation. One of our colleagues, Michelle Catanzaro from UNSW, is focusing in particular on visual language, and this is a plug for her. For us, anyone in Sydney who's there on the 27th of July, there's at the Powerhouse Museum, there's going to be an exhibition of the visual images that we've been collecting, and in particular the placards where young people are going to come and exhibit and talk about their work. So just before I hand over to Rob, I just want to say that we're talking about young people and climate change, but we also need to acknowledge that young people's presence in the public sphere is not a new phenomenon. Young people have always been present politically, whether they're sort of, the objects of discussion for politicians, or themselves engaging in political action. If we look back in history, they've played a major role in a lot of the sort of big social movements and revolutions that we have had. We're also quite interested in all the questions that this raises about the issue of intergenerational justice, especially when we look at the consequences of this for young people now alive and young people or people yet to be born. So that's one of the things that we're focusing and working on right at this minute, along with that sort of segues into what we're finding in the actions of young people themselves and others, working often in solidarity with older people, as what this means for the old ontology, and whether or not we're seeing the emergence of new old. I say new old in recognition of the many Indigenous worldviews or ontologies that resonate with some of the new ones that have been emerging over the last couple of years. And I have probably taken up my 7.5 minutes, and now I hand over to Rob Watts.
Thanks, Judith. And we're coming to you from Wurundjeri land on the Yarra River. Our project, I think, is explicitly political, and in that sense, it's not surprising that we got vetoed back in Christmas 2021 by Minister Stuart Robert. The politics are not just about climate change, they're also about the position that young people and children have historically occupied in what we would frame as an adultist framework, which treats young people as defective adults, deficient in all sorts of ways. So we're pushing back against that prejudice, which we encounter not only within our own universities, where we have to deal with ethics committees who put a ban on not doing research on young people without
or with
consent. Anyway, the paper we presented at TASA was the first fruit, I suppose, of our work, and of course it has some historical antecedents in that some of the people that we're working with had been doing work well before the ARC project was even a glint in anyone's eye. So there is an historical element to the paper, which is about the role of young girls and young women as leaders and as participants in this quite extraordinary efflorescence of social movements in the last 3 or 4 years. We also have to acknowledge, of course, the impact of COVID, which really did have a quite devastating impact, and I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Our paper is about the speech making of young girls, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, who organised, mobilised those extraordinary sequence of climate strikes beginning in regional and capital cities in Australia in late 2018. The study was set out to establish whether there was any explicit reflexivity, both about the gendering of the politics of climate change that's been going on in places like Castlemaine or Melbourne or Sydney or Newcastle, ACT and so on, but also whether there's any explicit understanding of the politics that they were engaging in. And here we just make a slight reference to maybe the work of Jacques Rancière and his idea that politics is quite different from policing. Policing is about the maintenance of a status quo and of the positions that people occupy in that status quo. And he talks quite plangently, I think, about the idea that politics is about people claiming a part in a situation where they've not had hitherto a part. And so we understand politics here is very, very much in that Rancièrean way as an attempt to claim a place, to claim a part, to be participating in that full-on sense. So we can clearly say that the speeches we've looked at and are about to be, I think, produced in a leading journal in this country indicate both gendered reflexivity, and that goes to interesting questions about why girls and why not boys? Why aren't boys as important a part of the process as we might have thought it would be the case? So we're talking here, I think, about quite important self-understandings, which both Milo and Olivia, I think, are highlighting in their work as well. So most recently, we're in Castlemaine, post-COVID, and we were dealing with the phenomenon of young people, new people who haven't aged out yet, who are coming to assume leadership roles in a context now no longer dominated by a coalition government, but by a new Labor government, which is doing pretty much the same sort of things as predecessor governments have been doing, which is not much at all. I'll pull it to a halt there and say thank you for your attentiveness.
Thank you so much, both Rob and Judith. Now, we've got time for questions, but while I can't see any, oh yeah, Justine. Would you like to go ahead, Justine?
I was just clapping.
I should be looking more intently at the icons. While we're waiting for someone then to raise a question, Judith, you mentioned something about visual images in Sydney. Was that on the 27th of July or June? Or maybe you could...
I'm pretty sure it's July.
Yes.
Michelle, are you here?
I am. It's the 27th of July.
The 27th of July, yeah. And I encourage anybody who's interested in this to go. It sounds like it's going to be an amazing exhibition. It's at the House Museum in Sydney.
I might email you, Judith, and
yeah, that'd be terrific.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone?
Can I ask a question of Judith? Yes. Just picking up on those environmental justice claims, and particularly the involvement of First Nations movements in the in-school strike. Was it the young women that were saying that to you predominantly? Was that brought up independently, or were you reflecting on the research that you've read?
So I just need to clarify your question, Milo. You were asking of me, were you? Yeah. Yeah. You said Indigenous.
Yeah, so just that
okay.
You made mention of the fact that you were picking up on these the broader environmental justice claims in the Indigenous movement. So I was just reflecting on that. Okay. So when we attended like the Castlemaine one, there was a special time for Indigenous speakers to speak. But when I spoke of the Indigenous, the reference, my memory is that I was talking about how we're
exploring the idea of new ontologies along with a lot of other people. But I use that word new-old because in recognition that some of the ways in which we might reject the modern Western dominant ontology, we are all, and exploring new old ones, is also to recognise the many Indigenous worldviews that don't sort of separate so-called society from nature and see material, non-material, humans, non-humans as interdependent. That's what I think that's what I was saying. That's what I thought I was saying.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now Josephine has her hand up, so go ahead, Josephine.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Mhm.
Thanks so much. That was really exciting, great presentation. And I do have a side question, which is how quickly do the TASA videos go up? Because I know some people that are going to want to definitely look at this one. It's fabulous research. Thank you. I guess it brought to mind for me that we've just watched the Giants about the environment movement that was happening through the 80s and 90s in Australia. And I just wondered, I don't know how much you have reflected or compared and contrasted that movement with the sorts of things that you're researching now, but I'd just love any comments that you might have, anybody, well, everybody that presented today on that. Thank you.
I've just got to rule myself out of contention because I was thinking so contemporaneously about climate change, and it got so little attention in the 80s. You know what I mean? Like it was. We know now how far back the knowledge goes, particularly in Liv was talking about the hegemony of big oil. But yeah, I haven't brought it up, but thanks for the tip.
Yeah, well, perhaps we can say that that's not something we've looked at directly, but that's not to say that there weren't many young people quite early on talking about those issues, like Saverne Suzuki, for example, I think was one of the first speakers at one of the, was it the UN? Rio, yeah. Who spoke incredibly powerfully about that issue. So, I mean, it's an interesting a question but we've not really explored it yet.
No.
Okay, thank you. To answer your question, Josephine, I promised to have this up by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Okay, and then there are a bit of a chat going on in the chat room. Sonia's made an interesting comment about the distinction between, or the dichotomy, adult and child. Sonia, wouldn't you like to talk about that, or would anyone? I think Judith, you may have brought that up initially.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something I'm reflecting on, and was particularly interested in the comments around that. And thank you, Judith, for sharing your experience of getting your ARC approved and finalised. So that was really fascinating. And I can't help but think about, the ethics of including children in research and what that actually means for the substance of the research. Yeah, there's so much in that, I think. So I don't have a specific question. It's more of just a reflection.
Mm-hmm. And
I was just going to really quickly say, even though we're not, we haven't interviewed activists themselves directly, I think that adult-child binary comes through in some of the framing around activists as well in the political discourse. So some of the ways that naivety is constructed as something that belongs to the young people, and malevolence or manipulative kind of behavior is something that belongs to the older activists in the movement. And yeah, so definitely it's there in the discourse in other ways as well, not just within the individuals engaging in political activism themselves.
Yeah. Oh.
We could quickly add that the whole adult-child binary has a history that we would do well to reflect on and remember clearly, given its origins in what we might call a civilizational or developmental discourse that goes back to the 18th century at least, and where you immediately are positioning in parallel terms natives and civilized people, children and adults. They're seen as analogues, and that's a distinctively modernist way of representing children and young people in, as we say in adultist terms, as defective in all sorts of ways, because they're not properly arrived at their developmental telos or whatever. So I think that's a huge problem, and I think we do need to really rethink how we conceive of age bands, and Bourdieu's also obviously made a huge impact in terms of talking about the contestation that's endemic in these classificatory processes which organizations go on about all the time. What's a child, what's an adult, what's a youth, what's a young adult, and away it goes. And it's it keeps lots of people off the streets, no doubt, and solidly embedded in these processes, but it doesn't advance the political or anthropological understandings that we actually need to develop.
Yeah, can I just add to that? About I think that binary does owe a lot to developmental theory, and it's just so deeply embedded in how we see the world. And I think that idea of recapitulation theory, I think it's Stanley Hall, how things live on, and where, and we still, some people still talk of young people using that language in terms of little savages or ferals or wild ones or whatever. So it's still there, alive and well, and something, I suppose, part of our own habitus that we've got to recognise and talk about and change.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Judith. Raywin has her hand up. So
sure. I have a question which is possibly more about the next stage of the research, but for what it's worth. One of the important things about Gramsci's approach to hegemony was that he never assumed hegemony was total. He was always looking at potential fissures and potential counter-hegemony. And I'm wondering, with all these research projects, if your findings are giving clues about potential cracks or weaknesses in the political and cultural position of the fossil fuel industries.
Liv, it's in the title of your
I'm just going to say, Olivia,
we're all learning.
You're all looking at me, and here is when I say I have ADHD, and I just lost track of what was going on just then. So I'll do my best, but if I've missed any of your question, Irwin, just jump in and let me know. I think there are, and maybe Vanessa, who's also online, could jump in because she works on this project too. There's cracks just in the simple fact that climate change is happening. Like we can't continue to ignore it and remain alive, basically. So like that's definitely one thing. But in terms of like what's coming through in the interviews and I guess are cracks appearing in the discourse itself, a little bit, like I think there's maneuvering that we've captured on the part of some of the people working in NGOs, for example, who like use some of these formulations to position themselves as more industry friendly, and therefore sort of try and push industry more towards acting on climate change, and try and break that, like, I guess, try and shift the political frontier, like try and break that stronghold of fossil fuel industry, and create alliances between what might otherwise be classified as radical climate activism and industry. I guess that's one of the ways that it kind of seems to be happening. Vanessa, do you have anything more to add to that? Because you did a lot of those interviews. So
yeah, hi everyone. Sorry, I forgot how you raise your hand in the system. Yeah, we're definitely seeing that. I mean, you can see it in the public discourse. We've seen it in the move away a little bit from coal to gas, and the gas industry. I've just started a project focusing particularly on that, extending our work a little bit to specifically look at that. And you can see, I just went to a day at the APIA conference, which was very interesting. And you can see, you know, they're getting ready to launch an ad campaign that's really similar to what the coal industry has previously done, talking about how they're, you know, completely necessary to our everyday lifestyles, you know, how they supply jobs, fund community services. I think there's a real sense from that industry that they're getting scooped up with the pushback on coal, and they're trying to defend that. I think there's some real nervousness there, which I think to a large extent shows how successful some of these movements over the long term have been with highlighting the impact of fossil fuels as a whole. Because of course that industry has also had pushback before they've even really got off the ground, you know, with moratoriums and whatnot. And the other section that we're definitely seeing in is the finance sector, where you've seen a lot of those, a lot of NGOs sort of shift their focus. I guess that's what Liv was sort of getting to as well, to put pressure, stakeholder pressure and social license pressure on those industries. So I think they're areas where we're seeing these sort of fissures come up. And certainly, you know, the fossil fuel sector is sort of, you know, cracking in that regard. But of course, it's always just a matter of how quickly and what the outcomes are.
Yep. Yeah, because there was some of that stuff in the interviews as well about the differentiating between metallurgical coal, coal for energy, like yeah,
it's
so
not us, it's the others.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they're aware of that, of those potential points of fracture, and they try and guard against it. Definitely. Yeah.
Thanks, Vanessa and Olivia, for that. Now Judith has her hand up. Or Rob.
Well, very quickly, I think to Irwin's excellent question, capitalism has never been solidary or unified about anything. It's an intrinsically competitive ensemble or assemblage. We've seen evidence for some time now of young people in particular leading corporate accountability moves, you know, challenging in the courts and in the boardrooms the preferences that have been given to traditional fossil fuel production. Secondly, you've seen the fact that these industries themselves have known for a long time what they're up for, what they've been doing, and the leak in 2016 of ExxonMobil internal documents indicating that they had known for a long time and had the scientific evidence perfectly in front of them about their contribution to fossil fuel emissions and global warming. And I think then you've got, the contemporary moves by, as I think Olivia indicated and Vanessa, the shift by other sectors that put pressure back on these traditional carbon dominated industries. So I think, you know, we're witnessing all sorts of fractures that have always been there, but I think the question is how, you know, politically you use these fractures to let more light in, to use a Cohen phrase, and open up the fractures in ways that become politically useful. Oh, yeah,
Many
yeah,
can't.
yeah, of course. So yeah.
Okay. We've approached and gone over our hour. That doesn't mean we have to finish straight away, but I notice people are leaving. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, I'd like to thank all the presenters, Olivia, Milo, Rob, and Judith. Sorry, yeah, thank you. I wish you a great day. And for Vanessa, for Josephine, I promise to have the video up on YouTube by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. So good afternoon and goodbye, everybody.